Just before we get started, a few things about how the event will work. We're recording the session and it will be uploaded to our website afterwards. There'll be approximately 20 minutes or so from our speakers before we move into questions from the audience. For the questions, please post them in the Q&A and then we'll invite you to unmute so you can ask your questions directly. When asking your questions, please state your name and, if applicable, your organisation. Unable to unmute, please do let us know and we'll ask the question for you. As we near the end of the event, we may group the questions to try to get through as many as possible. So please don't be shy in asking your questions, because we usually get a lot of them and we can't get through all of them. So get in quick, because I want to make sure I ask your question. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Professor Wayne Powell is the Principal and Chief Executive of Scotland's Rural University College. Oh dear, I've got that wrong straight away. Before joining SRUC, he was Chief Science Officer at the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, and prior to this, he was Professor and Founding Director of the Institute of Biological, Environmental and Rural Sciences at Aberystwyth University. Wayne's current external roles include membership of the Science Advisory Council of the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the Scottish Science Advisory Council and convener of the Research and Knowledge Exchange Committee of University Scotland, and he's also a Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Wayne's personal research interests revolve around plant genetics, genome science, plant breeding and conservation genetics of resources, with a strong emphasis on the delivery of public good outcomes. And joining Wayne today is Fran van Dijk. Fran is the Chief Executive of sustainability consultancy One Stone Advisors and Chair of the Macaulay Development Trust and Deputy Chair of the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. Fran advises on managing opportunity and risk to build long-term value, working with corporates to ensure that their business strategy, sustainability values and communications align. She helps emerging sustainability leaders integrate the UN Sustainable Development Goals into their strategy and prioritise the goals for better business planning. Fran holds degrees from the University of Cambridge and the European Association of Environmental Management Education. She is co-author of the book Creating a Culture of Integrity, Business Ethics for the 21st Century. So we've got two fantastic people and I'm looking forward to a great discussion today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Wayne to set the scene and tell us all about what he thinks, which was teed up really well in the event blurb. So I'm not reading it through again today. So over to you, Wayne.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Susan, for that introduction. And apologies for the complicated nature of my background, including Aberystwyth, but it's a fantastic pleasure to be here this afternoon. So, and thank you for the David Hume Institute for hosting this, and to Fran for helping with this conversation. So how do I want to frame this? I think I want to frame it around two things. Last week, I had the pleasure of presiding over a graduation in Bute Hall in Glasgow. This graduation is the highlight of our academic year. And really my reflections on that were that in many ways, the Bute Hall in Glasgow is a symbol of the Industrial Revolution. It sits at the intersection of industry, talent and nature, and essentially was built in ancient sunlight. So the process of photosynthesis that developed complex carbohydrates, that developed fossils, and eventually the fossil fuel that drove the Industrial Revolution. So I suppose my challenge and my prompting to our graduates last week was really, now this is an opportunity to build a sustainable future built around natural capital. And obviously focusing on the need for innovation skills to deliver that. The second part of, I guess, my introduction is really COP26, again in the city of Glasgow, where we had governments and industry laying out commitments to climate change, net zero, and a just transition. But also, I suppose, reflecting on the Wreath lectures that Mark Carney gave in 2020 and emphasizing the inflection point that we're at, and essentially an opportunity as well. And I think the focus and opportunity to better align our values with what we really value. So I suppose what I want to kind of conclude with in terms of perhaps framing this conversation is that we're at an important inflection point, in terms of opportunity, particularly here in Scotland, and a necessity globally to build economies around natural capital, the role of innovation and education, but also, like everything else in life, timing is so important. And I'm very conscious of using up too much time. And in about 25 minutes, we may have a new Prime Minister for the UK. So I'll pause and stop there, Susan. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Wayne. Fran, do you want to turn your camera on and join us? Brilliant. Thanks, Fran. Do you want to give us your thoughts?
So obviously, I think the COP last year was a really important moment, and I think the key thing for me was the inclusion of nature in the COP, which had never been done before. That discussion, that the recognition that we can't go to where we want to go to without addressing nature-based solutions. So really, I'd love to ask you, Wayne, in terms of the work that you're doing, you mentioned graduation. That's a very exciting time. You've got young people going into this essential field. What excites you most about what they're challenging you on, about the direction they want to go in? What is it you're hearing that gives you hope from young people?
I think there's two or three things that excite me and reflecting on COP26. The first is that I think we're hearing more voices coming to the table and having voices from different generations. So we're dealing with a transgenerational issue. So I think first of all there's that. I think from COP26, I think it was, first of all, it was great, it was in Scotland. I think there was an opportunity as well for us to showcase innovation and also the kind of skills and the type of skills that marry cognitive learning with vocational skills and the emotional skills is really, really important. I think the other thing that I think our students are challenging us on is the fact for us actually to embrace climate change within our own business models, with the way in which university and colleges are run, where our investments are going. All of these things become very, very important, as well, of course, as the traditional areas we focus on and teach on, and that is the future of food, the future of land use, the future of agriculture. I mean, in terms of COP26, Fran, I think there were some things which, we can obviously, we obviously wanted it to go further, but there were some important things. Pledges in terms of deforestation being one, methane emissions being another. I think the Glasgow Finance Alliance is really is also interesting. So many things actually, but it's a very, very important topic, and one which I think is important that we also don't lose sight of the significance and importance of optimism in terms of taking these areas forward.
Thanks, Wayne. Can I just ask, so we've got a really mixed audience here today, and so some of the things they might understand and some might not. So just can you give us a quick definition of natural capital, just in case there's anyone that doesn't understand that? And also you said about how students are challenging you to bring cognitive learning and vocational skills together. It'd be really good to have an example of that, just so people that haven't been around that might able to understand it better.
So in brief, I mean, natural capital would be those areas which are dependent on natural resources, air, water, land, the sea, that really underpin many of Scotland's iconic industries, whether this is food and drink, tourism, farming, land use, the marine sector. And of course, it's an area where Scotland has a comparative advantage, and indeed tourism. So those areas which are, and including renewable energy. So these are kind of the broad areas. What I really mean by, again, it is confusing, and I think we confuse it even further with the concept of tertiary education. But in terms of what I mean there is that for probably more than 200 years, and for some universities a lot longer, most of our learning has been based on cognitive, academic focused learning. And I think if we look at the challenges we face, particularly in terms of productivity, we've got to bring alongside that two things: a blend of learning which is much more practically orientated, vocationally orientated, alongside the facilitation, the soft skills, the communication skills that we're going to need into the future. And I think providing an opportunity for a much more plural approach to university and college education, coupled with, I think, really embracing the fact that we're going to need to have really lifelong learning embedded in what we do in a way which we've never experienced before. If we look at the sectors now around natural capital and the opportunities, it's going to require significant upskilling and reskilling. I'm not sure if that helps.
You're on mute, Susan.
Darn, I knew I was going to do that. That famous phrase that you hear too often still. Fran, you've been around the natural capital agenda for quite a long time, haven't you? Do you see changes in that sphere?
I mean, I've certainly been around the sustainability agenda for a long time. And I noticed that natural capital started to come up as a term, this idea that that nature offers us services. We call them ecosystem services. So nature provides us with clean water, clean air. It can even filter pollution to a certain extent. It provides us with the resources that we need to farm, and also beautiful landscapes that we can invite people to come and visit. So that has been emerging, and measuring that natural capital has been a real theme that's been growing hugely these last 5 years. And there is one area I would like people to hear about, because I think it's incredibly important from a business perspective, which is where I come from, which is that just as the Bank of England and Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney worked together to develop something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Now there's something, it's short, TCFD for short. Now there is something called TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures. And the reason that that is so important for this natural capital is those task force place the responsibility for understanding risk in your value chains at the very highest level of companies, at the board level. Boards are responsible for knowing what risk there is throughout their portfolios, throughout their value chains on both climate and nature. And so for any agricultural company, for instance, Nestle or Mars, or even, for instance, a whiskey company, understanding what climate risks, what nature risks might mean to their business is hugely important. And this is a seismic shift from the corporate side, which is where I come from, and incredibly important, and an opportunity, I think, Wayne, for the corporate world to connect much more with what you're talking about in terms of education. The people that will be coming up through SRUC and other organizations will be educated in this and be able to jump straight into understanding, managing that risk from day one when they join these companies.
Wayne, I see you nodding vigorously there.
Well, I mean, I wanted to come in and say, first of all, formally, I don't know, but I do know with our engagement with companies such as Nestle in the developments that are taking place in the south of Scotland, with a significant investment on levelling up and strengthening places, the corporate social responsibility and the requirements to ensure sustainability in supply chains are really, really important. And I'm seeing a major upturn in that. And also in terms of the master's programs we teach on ecological economics, this is becoming a really, really important part as well. So I don't know, Fran, about the sort of formal framework around the governance at those board levels, but certainly at one point I was on the corporate social responsibility board of Waitrose. And for that retailer, things such as animal health, animal welfare, all of those things were really, really important in terms of at board level, in terms of supply chains. I do want to touch on one point though around natural capital, which is probably something that I could have brought out in my introduction, and that is that if we look at Scotland's national strategy for economic transformation, natural capital is a cornerstone of that. So we see that natural capital now as being a really important part of Scotland's economic policy framework. And I think that's a major, major step forward. And in terms of those 4 pillars, nature and natural assets are an important part of that.
Mm-hmm. I really agree. And I think kind of as a corollary to that, let's not exclude the social side and the just transition, which is going to be part of that. And we find ourselves in the hot seat there in natural capital with rewilding and fear of land grabs, and that's a kind of another element of this discussion that we need to be very cognizant of, and how do we do this in a way that's best for everybody. I've got a question that I'd be really interested in your view on, Wayne, which is, we've got some quite interesting technological developments happening in agriculture at the minute. We've got vertical farming, we've got very precise use of fertilizers, for instance, rather than sort of much wider spreading. And ultimately, certainly in my field in sustainability, everyone is really very excited about the role for tech, whether it's AI or big data, various ways of tech being applied. Could you, what do you think is most interesting in your field when it comes to tech, or is there just simply such an explosion that it's hard to put your finger on anything?
Well, first of all, I think it's a really exciting time and an exciting opportunity for the broad area of natural capital, and particularly agri-food, because in some ways these developments take place outside our sector, and therefore the way in which these are absorbed and developed become really important. I'll talk a little bit about it in a moment, but the one thing I want to add on to that is that I don't think we can really talk about that innovation without talking about the skills we need to deploy that innovation going forward as well. So I think that the one area that SRUC is firmly focused on is how we can bring that innovation together with the people with the skills to be able to deploy that in a way that addresses both local issues as well as global issues. So in terms of some of the technologies, well, I think there's a whole range of these technologies, and one of them, to pick up your own personal interest, Fran, is in terms of sensor technology, in terms of data analytics, in terms of machine learning. And we have a superb example of that being deployed in the south of Scotland. So we've got about 30 million of investment coming from the UKRI government and from the Borderlands deal to create essentially a digitally twinned dairy. And this will be the first digitally twinned dairy in the UK. And digital twinning is a process by which you can marry, if you will, the sort of physical world with the virtual world through sensors, through capturing of data, and then modeling to virtually see that world in a way where you can start addressing some of the changes you want to undertake in a systems-based approach. So this will be the first digitally twinned dairy in the UK. It will address questions around net zero. It will address questions around how we can move forward advanced value manufacturing in an area that's really important. So that's a good example of computing digital twinning, addressing a major challenge around climate change and net zero, but also advancing economic prosperity. I suppose the other example which comes to mind, I won't go into my own area of genetics for now, but I think that other aspects of technology and innovation that's really important is how we can sort of join these areas of technology up. So by that I mean the areas of circularity. So we've got a number of examples whereby by capturing methane from cattle in a closed environment, combining that with combustible engineering processes, generate heat and electricity that can do two things. It can drive forward opportunities in vertical farming in a circular way, but in addition, can really take the waste from farm, slurry in particular, and produce concentrated urea essentially green fertilizer, which can then be applied more locally. So what we're talking about here is combining, I suppose, engineering, combining opportunities in terms of looking at systems in a circular way to combine with food production, high nutrient, low carbon food production as part of a circular farming system. And these are really important. And we have a number of examples of this going on in Dumfries and Galloway, in Easter Howgate, where some of my colleagues have been really developing these approaches, which is about synthesizing different technologies based on the principles of circularity, based on the principles of being much more predictive in the deployment of these technologies, but also looking at productivity in the context of net zero.
So can I just
So
ask a layperson's question? What does a digital twin dairy mean for the cow, and how is that better for the economy? Like, does it mean that you know much more about each individual cow and then you know when best to milk that single one rather than just doing everything at the same time? Or is it to do with the amount of feed? Or how? Tell us a bit more about that, Wayne, for people that don't understand what that is.
Well, actually, dairies are quite sophisticated anyway, what this though involves, Susan, is taking it to another level by looking at the utilization of sensor technologies to be able to monitor both the individual cow in terms of monitoring its well-being, its welfare, monitoring what is going on within the microbiome, within the rumen of the cow, so we can monitor the intake of food, what is going on within the rumen in terms of the interaction between the microbiome, between the microbes within that system, to monitor the amount of methane that's produced, to monitor the efficiency of food conversion, to be able to monitor the health and well-being of that cow, but also to be able to look at that in terms of the environment from which that cow is getting its feed, from grass, from biodiversity, to monitor the emissions that are coming from that system. So having data, having sensors that capture that data, then taking that data and visualizing it and analyzing it so that you can then look at how this particular system could operate if you changed one or two of those parameters. Now we can do this, and I've been doing this in the past where we've been doing this in a singular way, okay? What this is about is doing it in a factorial way, in a systems-based way, so we can look at this in a much, much more comprehensive manner. And the Royal Society actually have just published last year a report on the role of digital twinning and computer science as one of the major technologies that will change, which will drive net zero contributions in the UK. It's used in other areas of advanced manufacturing. It's used in the development of cities in terms of managing light, managing energy. Because the systems we're dealing with are more complex, we need to be able to use data and computer science to address those challenges. So it's an example of that.
Fantastic. And I can see that Tom Maxwell has just shared some links in the chat.
I hope they can reinforce what I was saying, Tom.
I'm sure he has. Fran, have you got any more questions before we open it up to the audience?
I have got one, which is just to provide a little bit of balance. We've been talking a lot about the exciting things that are going on, both in terms of connecting across silos of different ways of thought and different ways of working, and in terms of the opportunities that are developing for us, certainly technologically. I'd love to hear a little about the key risks that you see, Wayne. It's not all motherhood and apple pie. It is going to be difficult. What are the challenges that you think we need to overcome that could stop us succeeding?
I think one of the real challenges that we face is really almost the license to operate, and that is really taking people with us on the journeys that we're on, and the communication around this, and the understanding of the importance and significance of this. So I think that one of the things I think we're all guilty of is getting so embedded in our areas that we forget about the need to be able to engage and communicate and the thought leadership that we need. I think the other thing that is really important is that in terms of data, for example, one of the big challenges is around the governance of data and the ownership of data, and how that ownership of data, how do we create trust in the deployment of data and the deployment of technology? So I think the governance around it, which is about the trust, is so important, and I think data in particular is an area which brings huge opportunities but huge challenges. Who owns that data? How is that data going to be used? And I think that's really important. I suppose the other thing that intrigues me, and particularly from an SIUC perspective, where on the one level we have a global reach, but also we need to reach at a local level. So balancing that global need with local needs and the communication around that is very, very important. So those are two areas, I think, which kind of are relevant.
Thanks, Wayne.
I'm just being told we've got a technical hitch with the chat function, so it's not open. So we're just trying to fix it. Tom has shared the links in the Q&A function. So what we're going to do is make sure that we share those around afterwards if we can't get the chat function working just now. Fantastic. So please do step forward, anyone that's got a question, and let us know what you want to ask Wayne and Fran. I've got another one that I'm kind of toying with. It's sort of in my head. There's something about farmers almost becoming, you know, in the past they were data analyzing in terms of the environment out in the field, but it's almost now like the data analysts are going to be much more stuck at the computer looking at they're almost going to be the data farmers, aren't they? There's something around that, Wayne.
Well, it's really interesting, and I think that in some ways farming has always been at the cutting edge of innovation. And if you look back to the sort of domestication of our livestock and crops, I mean, farmers were really at the heart of that. But I think we're going to go through an era where the skills level for farming and the technological input of farming is going to is going to rise, and I think we're going to need to see the farming community, but not just farmers, but that community, with being a lot more literate, both technologically and from a data perspective. But alongside that, we will see farmers still rooted in communities. So the cultural component of it still becomes very, very important, and some of those practical skills that I was referring to earlier on, whether this is in terms of cropping systems where you're going to have more integrated approaches with legumes, whether we're going to think about how we're going to be measuring soil health, monitoring soil health, husbandry, animal welfare, all of these things, and some of the precision that might be adopted in terms of livestock farming. I think it's going to be an exciting opportunity. I don't think it's one where I think we should be painting this as the end of farming as we know it. It's kind of an exciting opportunity within a very exciting industry.
Thanks, Wayne. There's a question from Donald McRae. Donald, do you want to unmute and ask your question in your own words? Technology allowing. Hopefully this is going
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, well, the subject we're discussing is natural capital, and Wayne made some really interesting comments about joining up in systems and producing urea as a so-called green fertilizer for instead of ammonia from the Haber process and so on. When you start talking about capital, though, you begin to think of its use, returns, and the maintenance of it. And struck me that if you were planning, say, a new investment in the countryside, let's be controversial and say it was a road and a car park and chalets to, you know, improve tourism and to use rather than exploit the natural capital, you might think, well, we need to produce some sort of calculation which incorporates the increased use of electricity, increased use of water, fossil fuel use, even through to increased plastic that might be discarded in the, you know, by the users, and even through to well-being as well. Now, my question is, I know that such a framework doesn't exist, but we're all crying out for it, because I'm faced with investment decisions like that every day, and I'm increasingly asking, where's the carbon calculation? Where's the overall natural capital calculation? And are we anywhere near having a framework that is commonly accepted and is not being produced by various interested groups who have a particular angle?
Go for it, Wayne.
Well, thanks, Donald. A really interesting question. Of course, it's something which our consultants are supporting businesses on all of the time. So one of the things that's really interesting about SRUC and important is that our consulting offering offers more business support to SMEs of any college or university in the UK. And it does address some of those points, Donald. I think one of the tools that my colleagues have been developing in SRUC, going from work initially on geochemistry of soil, right through to the translation of this into a model that can be deployed, is something called AgriCalc, which is a tool that has been developed that can support the carbon balance on farms and on other business enterprises across Scotland and the UK. I think there's over 4,000 interested subscribers in that already, which has been taken forward. So the way in which we model that and the way in which we build those models in to support many of these rural enterprises, Donald, is, as you know, very, very important. But alongside that, I think, is going to be not just the model in terms of carbon calculators, but also we have to be thinking about the price of electricity going forward and the price of energy and how that is going to shape some of these. So we need to build into the resilience into these business models as well. And that's, of course, again, another part of what the future farming sector is going to need. There's going to be farmers who are going to need business acumen in terms of dealing with all of these areas as well.
And Fran, what do you see about the companies you work with? Is there anything there on investment appraisals and things like that Donald's asking about?
Well, there have been so many different ways of approaching this. For a long time, we've had something called life cycle assessment, which looks at the impact of an activity or a product over its entire life cycle, but that tends to be environmental impact. You can integrate into that economic impact. We were never very good at integrating social impact because that is so geographically specific. It's hard to do. You need to make it very location specific. So there's lots and lots of thinking going on around these models. There's natural capital accounting, for instance, which looks at those long-term ecosystem services and what adjustments to landscape activity, what that will mean for the natural capital and the services it can deliver. And one of the organisations I'm involved with, I can see Deb Roberts is here, is the James Hume Institute, and at Glensoch, their farm there, they're doing long-term experiments around natural capital accounting. And being a research farm, they're able to do this over long periods of time and get really quite reliable results. And so fascinating work going on there. So there's multiple ways of approaching this. No silver bullet yet, but we are beginning to get there. And of course, I mentioned the TNFD earlier. The fact that people at the most senior level of the largest corporates are being asked to be accountable for nature-based risk in their companies and in their supply chains mean they will have to know the numbers, not just the economic numbers, but the impact on land and ecosystems as well, and manage those. They're being required to set targets, to manage and to report. So these things will be developing along long agricultural supply chains as well.
And I think, if I may, Fran, I think the other review that was commissioned, which is pertinent to this question, is the Descriptor review.
Descriptor, yeah.
And I think that in many ways brings these areas together, challenges the concept of GDP, was commissioned by the Treasury. We'll see how much appetite the government has to take those areas forward. And of course, from SRUC's perspective, the Kirkton Upland, the Hill and Mountain Research Centre has been doing this sort of work for 20 or 30 years, looking at long-term experiments of agroforestry, integrating livestock, integrating technology to try and answer some of these questions, which are quite complex. But that innovation is going to be really important for us as we move forward.
Thanks, Wayne. Just before we go to our next question, I'm really aware that the announcement from Westminster is imminent, and you touched on it Wayne, in terms of Dasgupta review. For anyone that's not looked at that, do Google it, or perhaps someone can post a link in the chat to share it. It was a phenomenal report that was pretty well received, but I've not heard any mention of anything to do with that in the leadership race at all. In fact, I've not really heard any mention of anything to do with COP26. Where does that put the UK going forward? You know, we've talked a lot about some of the good changes coming out of COP, but will we see the other ones come into fruition, do you think?
Is that a question for me, Susan?
Yeah, go on. Well, Fran can take it if she wants, but you're probably at the cutting edge because you're definitely involved in lots of.
Yeah, look, I think that the first thing is that with the new leadership of with the new Prime Minister, it's going to be really, really important that there's strong leadership, but also strong wisdom. And I think the ability to engage and listen to evidence, and making sure that that evidence is based on sound, independent science from both the social sciences and other areas of science. But I think having that evidence base to address complex policy issues going forward is going to be really important, and not losing sight of that of the evidence that's needed to address these complex challenges is going to be vital.
Thanks, Wayne. Fran, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we all here agree on evidence-based decision making, and not just scientific evidence as well. And I think Wayne touched on this before. It's the way that you communicate that evidence that's so important, so that everybody feels included, and that we can move forward together. I think sometimes we have been a little bit exclusive in the way that these important scientific topics have been discussed. And if you look, for instance, at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the way they have changed how they communicate the outcomes of their reports over time, I think particularly the 2008 report, when we started to understand how many species extinctions would happen in a 1.5 degree world versus a 2 degree world, it was a completely different way of communicating what climate change would mean than previous, pretty carefully worded, quite bland statements about the expectation of species loss. So that's another part where I think, yes, we need to be evidence-based, but we also really need to think about our communications. And that's not easy. You know, really good science communication isn't easy. And then linking that to engaging communities, you know, from the ground level right to the highest political level, is also very challenging. Let's spend some time on doing that and getting everyone on board.
Thanks, Fran. Well, just in case anyone was in any doubt, it's Liz Truss. I can let you know in case anyone isn't keeping an eye on that. I do think Fran brought it in there, but I think storytelling is just as important as the evidence at the moment, because some of the evidence just isn't cutting through with the people it needs to be that are in positions of power. So how we translate the sort of really technical stuff into language that everyday people can understand, I think that's why sessions like this are probably so important, you know, and the outreach that SRUC do to say, look, all this really good stuff is happening. How do we tell people about it? And I think vertical farms is one of the things that, you know, there's been quite a lot of press on, but there's quite a lot of other things that are evolving, that are changing really quickly too. One thing that occurred to me.
Can I come in, Susan?
Yeah,
I just think that the 2 points that you're making around evidence and so on, and having been on advisory councils both in Scotland, England, and elsewhere, you're quite right that the narrative is also really important, and particularly when you're dealing with the complexity that we're dealing with now. So kind of having a reference narrative is so important, because the complexity means that it's sometimes difficult to bring a purely evidence-based approach to it. And I think as well, using that narrative as a source of creativity, but that imagination and creativity is going to be really important too. Yeah.
I do think food securities come right back up the agenda. You know, there was a lot in the media about this probably, what, 10 to 15 years ago. And I think just the energy crisis has made that much more at front of people's minds. And when we're talking about, you know, the next step on from food banks is now warm banks, you know, are we one step away from a, you know, dig for victory type campaign, so that everyone is using every bit of land to grow food for themselves? Or am I just being a bit too apocalyptic, Wayne, do you think?
I think it's good that we now have a food strategy in the Westminster government, and we have a good food nation bill in Scotland. I think what it's done is brought food much more to the centre of the public mind. Again, it's an example of a really complex challenge, but something which is fundamental. I think what we're seeing is, first of all, a recognition of the importance of food at the epicenter of energy and health and diet. I think we see it right at the center of localism as well. And I also think we see it in terms of really, perhaps one of the things would be really interesting, and this is again a challenging point, but whether we can shift the concept of food from a supply-driven to a demand-driven economy. So what actual food do we need? How do we produce it? How do we grow it? So it's not necessarily easy, but that I think is another component of how we look at food. And of course, again, if we look at Scotland, food and drink is our #1 export industry. So a really interesting balance there between added value production alongside the need to have localism.
Mm-hmm. We've got a slightly controversial question come in from an anonymous attendee, which I think is aimed at you, Wayne, which is it time for the educational model of universities to change?
Yes.
In what way?
I have no idea who's answered that question, but thank you very much. So look, at the moment, SRUC is not an university, we're a college, and SRUC confuses people, their nomenclature. So we're Scotland's Rural College. We're right at the moment going through, with vigour and pace, taught degree awarding powers. We've been teaching degrees for over 100 years, and I think we've been doing it superbly well. Our degrees have been awarded by Edinburgh and Glasgow. The reason that we are undertaking this journey of getting taught degree awarding powers and research degree awarding powers is because we firmly believe that we need a new model in the university sector. And I think the reason we need that has been spelt out by Andy Haldane recently, where you've probably seen the reports that are coming out of the Royal Society and on Envision and the future of education. And the point that Andy makes is that this is the first time since the Industrial Revolution our children are worse off than our parents. And it's staggering, not only in terms of economic benefits, but in terms of health as well. So this is a really interesting time, really an inflection point. And what he puts this down to is, first of all, productivity and a stagnation in productivity. And that our universities, as I said earlier, need to be more plural in their outlook in terms of what we teach and how we teach it. So bringing the cognitive, the vocational, and the emotional skills together, but also really being much more open to the way we teach, how we teach, and also lifelong learning. And I think there's a real need for an university model that delivers that, a tertiary model, and that is something that we're moving forward with in terms of our own aspirations to become a university. We are walking the talk in terms of creating the first vet school in Scotland for 150 years, which will be tertiary. And those, I think, are the examples that society needs and Scotland needs.
And how long does that journey take, you know, from being Scotland's Rural College to being an official university?
Well, again, not all of these things are in our hands, unfortunately, but we're working very hard with QA, and we hope that we'll have, we're going through the process now of exploring all our processes and procedures. So we anticipate maybe 12 months for an outcome on 20-degree awarding powers. And then to become a university requires it's not an our gift, it's mandated by the Privy Council. But I think the other point about this, which is really important, is that if we look at those countries which have been very, very successful in modeling their economies around natural capital, if we look at the Scandinavian countries, if we look at New Zealand, if we look at the Netherlands, which has been very successful in terms of agri-food export, all of them have an agri-food university. And all of them have an agri-food university that is really focused on natural capital and the way in which that natural capital can support both prosperity, but also the health of the nation as well. So that is one of the big drivers for us, is really making sure that we can take forward. This is not so much about SRUC, it's what we can do for Scotland and more globally as well.
Thanks, Wayne. Fran, is that what you experience, both from you employ graduates, but you also work in different countries overseas? Do you notice any difference between Scotland and other countries?
Do I notice difference between Scotland and other countries in terms of education? I think it's very similar, actually. The main differences I notice is at the undergraduate level, for instance, where people tend to be allowed to spend a lot more time doing their undergraduate course. I think everybody I know is very aware of the continuous education element. So, for instance, I'm doing a course right now on sustainable finance, a short course, just because I think it's really important to keep myself on the ball and on top of things. And lots and lots of people I know do those short, some short courses every now and then. So, yeah, I would say there's a genuine understanding that we have to keep learning, partly in this field, not just sort of the agriculture part, but sustainability generally. Things are moving so fast that you have to keep up to speed with your, a specialism. You can't do the whole thing, but you need to really keep on top of stuff, because otherwise you will be left behind. And that is, that's just suddenly this is taking off very, very quickly.
Another way, though, of looking at that, Susan, is posing the question: where does our productivity in agri-food sit relative to these comparative countries? And if you look at it, if you look at the productivity in our own agri-food sector compared to somewhere like Norway or Ireland, first of all, we're a third of the productivity of Ireland and about a quarter of that in Norway. So it's kind of obviously we can ask our graduates and but we can also look at this from the point of view of where are those countries that have a really, really productive, where they have a high performing innovation and skills ecosystem, and all of them have an agri-food university right at the heart of it.
Okay, thank you. I've got another anonymous attendee in question. I wish you would put your names to it and ask it in your own words. I'll try and read it out. Do we really need to convince people? ? I'm increasingly coming to the opinion that we have run out of time to convince people to change, and some never will. We have to enforce change, starting with big businesses and high net worth individuals causing problems. However, that requires political will. That's the biggest challenge we face. Vested interests. See any of Truss's environmental comments. How do you get around that? ? Gosh, it kind of feels a bit more like a comment than a question. I'm not sure how to pose it to you. Do you want to react to that, Wayne and Fran? Do we need to convince people that climate change is still a problem?
I mean, if you look at Scotland, I mean, we already can see it. We can see, first of all, we have warmer climates, we have warmer summers, we have wetter winters, we have the sea levels rising. I mean, I think the evidence is there. I think that the point that we were touching on earlier on is the narrative becomes very important, the leadership becomes really important, the convening becomes really important, and recognizing that this is a transgenerational issue. So we just have to keep going. There's no doubt about that, and ensuring that we provide the environment, as I said earlier on, for innovation skills that are going to be so important in this area into the future.
Thanks, Fran.
And also, I know there's an immediacy around some of these issues at the moment, the rates of inflation, the cost of energy, etc. But alongside that, we have to be able to keep an eye on what those medium and long-term goals are.
Mm-hmm. I think it's hard with that immediacy, but almost, I think I see more and more solar panels being installed everywhere that probably could have been done before. So actually, there's a push to do it now that there wasn't before. So maybe that speed of change is going to happen faster. Fran, do you want to react to the point that climate change isn't a religion? It's not something you believe in or not. It's happening.
It's happening, and I have sympathy with the questioner. Actually, there are a lot of vested interests. I think that was a term that was mentioned. Whose interest it is to keep change as slow as possible. And in my field, we tend to notice sort of 3 stages of big corporates resisting, you know, whether it's tobacco or industrialized food, or in terms of processed food, or indeed climate change. You know, the first stage is denial, then it's confusion, try and put out facts there, and then it's delay. And for climate change, we're in the delay phase. They just, you know, the vested interests just want to keep the money going for as long as they possibly can before they need to either switch model or slow down. And we're very aware of that, and they're using very specific methods to do those delays, amongst which they know that they've lost the climate change argument, but they can say other things like, for instance, oh, but you know, we offer young people lots of work in oil and gas. Well, so do lots of other areas, and so do renewables. You offer young people lots of work, but they've got the money to put the adverts out. So the good thing is, for instance, the Advertising Standards Authority has much greater powers now. So greenwashing is more difficult. So that's one part that is being controlled. I would agree that we need political will to make this happen, and we don't have that at the moment in the UK, in Westminster. I would say we have more of it here. We just need the power and to influence that transition to happen faster. And we're not seeing the full weight of government power going behind that yet. And it would be great to see more vociferous efforts to make it happen faster.
Thanks, Fran. I'm getting a thanks in the chat as well from a recent graduate. I won't read out the full quote, but it's a thanks for being so honest, both of you, I think. We're moving into the end of the event, and I'm mindful I want to give you two both one last sort of thing that you want to leave the audience with. But just before we do, I'd like to thank everyone for coming along today, and mention that our next event will be on the 3rd of October. Where we'll be launching our new research on the Great Risk Transfer. So please do keep an eye out. As follow-up to this event, we'll be sending out the link in case anyone wants to register. It really is a fantastic report that is very timely, I think, and it's in partnership with the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. And as a charity, we can only continue to bring these free events as a result of donations. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if you'd like to donate. And as regular attendees know, we deliver these because of our commitment to diversity of thought, and we want to make sure as many people as possible hear different views that they might not in their everyday jobs. So right, I will come to Fran first and then Wayne. Fran, what thoughts do you want to leave the audience with today?
Well, we finished on quite a kind of urgent point, and I just would like to make a slight break from the agricultural topic and ask everybody here to have a look at how their pensions are invested. One of the biggest ways you can make a difference is by making sure that any money you have is invested in a way that's going to aid this transition and not support any companies that are slowing it down. Or if they do support those companies through your investment, make sure that the person who's managing your investment engages with those companies and asks for change to happen. You can have 21 times more impact by doing this through your pension than you can through your daily purchases. So go to your pensions advisor and ask for your pension to be invested according to your values.
Fantastic, Fran. I can tell you that pensions does come up in the Great Risk Transfer Research Project. So all the more reason to plug that event coming up. And over to you, Wayne. What do you want to leave the audience with?
Well, just to say thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's really important we do have these conversations. I think in terms of our own trust funds, we've gone through that exercise, Fran, so a really important reminder. I guess.
Sorry, that's my mum ringing. Ever so sorry about that.
I just think that despite all of the wicked challenges that we face, there's some real opportunities. And I think, in fact, I think the Scottish Government do get it. I think the destination is clear. The journey isn't always clear, but I think, I want to conclude by saying that I think there's an opportunity to take these wicked challenges and turn them into opportunities. We're just about to launch an Alliance for Research Challenges, which will start bringing a systems approach to some of these challenges we're facing. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wayne. And apologies that my mum decides to ring at the end of the event, even though she's been told not to ring today. There'll be some drama somewhere. Apologies to the audience too. I can assure you that's never happened before, so it's bad luck for it happening today. Anyway, I'd like to thank Fran and Wayne for your time today and making time to share your thoughts with the David Hume Institute audience. And we will share the recording on the website afterwards. So if there's anyone that you think hasn't attended today that you want to share it with, please do share it. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you all again soon.